Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz. It's the middle of January and time for me to start talking about my best of 2025 reading. And why in the middle of January? Because I need a little time for it to sort of ferment and percolate. I can't do it in late December. I need to sort of sit on it for a couple of weeks at least, and go back and look and rethink and see what's stuck in my head and to make those choices. So I'm going to do a couple of videos for you about what I really enjoyed in 2025 to share with you, and maybe I hope inspire you to pick up some of these things, or to share what you enjoyed in that year, and if you've read any of these and want to have a conversation about any of them. I read 165 books, Storygraph tells me, in 2025. It's a bit weird because 2 of them were one book, two translations of a long text, and one was a picture book. I only put picture books sort of into my list if I deliberately read them for a reason, like for the Picture This readathon. I don't stick in all the picture books that I read to my lovely grandson. That would be crazy. So hence 165. I'm not going to give you a load of graphs and stats and so on, because although I quite enjoy hearing other people's, I always feel like it's a bit weird sharing it for me, not for other people, for me if I share this. But I will tell you a couple of things about my year's reading to give you a flavour of I suppose the mix of what I read, because it puts my favourites in context. So I aim to read globally, and this year I was hosting Reading the Globe readathon with Katja of Page Turners with Katja and Jack of Book Tray, and but that's something I do every year. And I read, and when I counted it up, books by authors from 52 different countries in 2025, which is, I feel, that's solid. And 50 books in translation, but there's not a direct correspondence between those. I might read, several books translated from one language and several books in English by authors from an Anglophone country. So, it's not like, Anyway, you understand. About 60% of what I read in 2025 was contemporary, so 21st century stuff, whether that's nonfiction or fiction or, but recent. And the other 40% is classics, backlist, and that's the sort of mix that I'm kind of comfy with. It means I'm not just all being sucked in by the new and shiny, when there's all the riches of the past to visit as well. The other thing I'll tell you is that I think 2/3 of what I read were novels or novellas, and then everything else comes in that other third, and that's a fair sort of representation of what I enjoy in reading. I like mix, but novels and novellas are the centre, the core of my reading diet, I guess. So this video, I'm going to talk about the best of the rest, the non-fiction, the poetry, the plays, the short stories that I enjoyed this year. And then I'll make another video where I talk about the best of the novels and novellas, whether contemporary or backlist or classic, and, or in translation or not. So, and if I have time, I'll add a little bonus feature to the end of this video, which is my worsts of 2025, which I don't normally talk about, but I'll just sort of drop in a couple. So let's start with nonfiction. And when I say nonfiction, I'm talking about prose nonfiction, history, nature writing, memoirs, biography, that as opposed to anything else that, Storygraph or whatever might stick in that category. And the first, I'm going to talk about 4 of the 23 books of that sort of nonfiction I read. I'm going to pick out my favourite 4. And I'm not going to rank them because they're so different. One of those was Raising Hare by Chloe Dalton, which came out in 2024. It was our group read for the People April readathon, reading books about real people. What a lovely, lovely book. So Dalton was living in the country during the COVID lockdown. She encountered a baby hare, a leveret, and thought it had been abandoned and was going to die, and decided to adopt it. And the book is about her relationship with that hare, with her efforts to keep it alive, and then to sort of make sure it could live as a wild hare despite having been raised by her. And then she also sort of goes down loads of rabbit holes about hares and how they, you know, what's known about them and they're not known about them and their behaviour, and yeah, and also, you know, brings a load of herself into the book. Really enjoyable. Completely different but an equally splendid book was this one, Black and British by David Olusoga. Olusoga is an academic historian, but he also does television programs and accessible books for, you know, the average interested reader, and this is one of them. And this is about the long history of people of Black African origin living, working, visiting the British Isles, and he gives sort of the overview for that. He puts it in the context of, you know, how it's sort of interconnected with British imperial history and so on. But also he goes into detail about individuals' lives in a way that brings the whole thing, you know, makes you have a connection and brings it to life in a wonderful way. Really super book. And he takes care to sort of act as the impartial historian, but then also is honest at times when he is moved or angered by things, and sort of where, you know, he has like a personal connection with what he's writing about, so that you know, he doesn't hide that, which I think in a way it sort of adds to my respect for him as a historian. The third non-fiction book that I'm going to talk about is, I don't have to wave at you. I will put everything though. I'll create timestamps and I'll put details of all the books in the description. So, is another book that brings together fact and sort of the personal, because it's Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney. It was published in 2025. Romney is a bookseller, book collector, and she became fascinated with the Jane Austen's kind of immediate predecessors and contemporaries as women writers, and why Austen is the one that we sort of set apart these days from all of those other women writers at the time. And you know, she sets to collect, to read to these other writers, to find out more about their history, and she shares that with us. At the same time, it's so there's a lot of kind of factual content, I suppose, in the book, but it's also very much about Romney, about her responses, her perceptions, her experiences as a bookseller, and what that brings to this topic. You know, it's not just about Jane Austen's Bookshelf, it's more about sort of Romney and her responses. And I actually really enjoyed that, although I think some people read the book expecting a different book maybe, and were sort of annoyed that there was so much Romney in it, but yeah, that worked really well for me. I buddy read it with Katie of Books and Things and Charlotte of CoynieReads, and sometimes those buddy reading experiences or group reading experiences, they make a book stick more in your mind, because you analyse more and share more and think more. But it was, I thought, a first-rate book, and on a topic that just has a huge fascination for me. The fourth of the 4 non-fiction books I picked as my best of the year is a bit of an outlier. I didn't share this with anyone else, although in a sense I did, because it was a gift from Shawn Books in Canada, because it's not available at the moment in the UK. It's called Nishga. It's by Jordan Abel. He's an Indigenous Canadian author who's, a lot of his sort of family are Nishga. But he was cut off from that because of family circumstances. And then as an adult, kind of went back and dug into it and restored those connections in his life. And this book is an exploration of that. I can't exactly describe it as a memoir, because it's more like a kind of a documentary. He puts together lots of different sort of documents, pictures, photographs, pieces of art, transcripts of interviews. It sort of, he's a poet, and there's something quite poetic about how he does that, but it's not a book of poetry. It's a book of non-fiction. Really interesting, hard to talk about, but had a profound impact for me amongst my 2025 non-fiction reading. So what about poetry? Now, I normally read a fair bit of poetry, and I only read 10 complete books of poetry in 2025, but I probably didn't read less actual poems, if you know what I mean, just because of the type of thing that I read. Okay, and I want to talk about kind of about 4 things, but with an honourable mention. So, 2 contemporary poetry collections that I read, which I thought were superb. If you hear a little squeaking in the background, it's my cat kind of having the zoomies in the hallway in the next room. Weird sound effects, but maybe you can't hear them. So 2 contemporary collections that I really rated, thought were absolutely superb. One was The Wickedest. Did I say Wickedest? Wickedest by Caleb Femi. He's came out in 2024, I read it early 2025, stuck in my mind. He's a British Nigerian poet and photographer. It's a novel in verse of a sort. And it's one night at a shub or house party. That's like a private dance party. And he follows different people, some of the DJs, some of the punters, people that come to dance, men, women, the organisers, and we get a sense of the music, the people, the atmosphere, the place, the sense of potential threat because they were technically illegal, all of that brought together in wonderful poetry and with photographs. Definitely a winner. A joyous book of poetry, I would describe that. He's really celebrating that sort of house party kind of culture. Now, the other book of contemporary poetry that I would warmly recommend to you, but is anything but joyous, was Forest of Noise by Mosab Abu Toha. Again, it was first published 2024. I read 2025. He's a Palestinian poet. He was living in Gaza when he started writing this collection, some of the poems in this collection. Then he was able to leave, but obviously left family and friends behind. And how do we write about something as awful as what's happened in Gaza over the last few years? How do you use art to explore the awfulness of something like that? He has done it really successfully. I think successfully in artistic terms. These are good poems, but also in terms of sharing his feelings and the experiences of people in Gaza in a way that kind of connected with me as a external person, an observer, a reader. It's intense, moving, beautiful. Moving on, I'm going to talk about 2 books of poetry which are at the opposite extreme of not being contemporary, quite the opposite. One of them was this, Sappho, Stung with Love, Poems and Fragments. Now, Sappho, I'm sure you know, was a real historical poet, ancient Greek, from around 600 BCE. We know a certain amount about her life, and she was enormously respected at the time as a poet and in the ancient period, but her poetry only survives in fragments, in scraps, in bits and pieces, really. So we need people to help us kind of access those, and this book is brilliant for that. It's possibly not the most poetic translation of the fragments that we have, but it's did I say the author Aaron Poochigian? But for every little fragment we get a detailed explanation, context setting, interpretation. It makes what type of poem was this from, what's known. He really makes it possible to understand and appreciate what are just in a sense bits and pieces, but very, very beautiful bits and pieces. And when I read other poets who kind of work from Sappho's fragments and perhaps restore them into poems of more coherent poems, I will always think back to this and the detailed context and explanation that it gave me. So then I said about I read a book where do I count it as one, do I count it as two? Doesn't matter, does it? The point is that I read two tremendous translations of Homer's Odyssey. Now, Homer, unlike Sappho, is not a known person. We attribute the Iliad and the Odyssey to someone called Homer, but there may not have been a Homer exactly. But there may have been. It's not clear. It was around 800 BCE. It's lost in the mist of time. Let's face it. But how fortunate we are to have the whole of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that we can translate them today and be connected back to, as I say, 800 BCE. Nearly, more than 2,500 years ago, nearly 3,000. And I don't include rereads in my best of videos each year, because you don't want to keep hearing about the same books by Jane Austen or George Eliot or whatever, do you? But I've read various bits of the Odyssey in the past, including bits in ancient Greek when I was a schoolgirl, but I've never read it cover to cover, so I felt it's legitimate to include it. And I read the Robert Fagles translation from 1997, and I listened to the Emily Wilson translation from, I think it's about 2017, so it's even more recent, and they complemented each other in really interesting ways, because Wilson really brings out the oral tradition, the oral quality, I suppose, of Homer, which most people at the time would have heard recited rather than read on paper, or scrolled papyrus, whatever. And whereas Fagles is perhaps a sort of more definitive version, but also a very good poet. What a joy to have read that, and I feel like it was mind expanding. Talking about poetry and reading something that's perhaps a little bit challenging. There's lots of story in this, so don't think of it as being too challenging to take on by any means. But sometimes it's good to really stretch yourself, and poetry can be a good way to do that. And so I'm going to give an honourable mention to TS Eliot's collected poems. I think I've probably just about read all of these before, so I shouldn't be including it in my best of, but I really enjoyed revisiting some of these in a group read with led by Thomas, and then that inspired me to read all of the works in his collected poems and to reread Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, which I just enjoyed. So that's an honourable mention for my poetry year. Now, plays. I read 9 plays. 9? Yeah, no, 10. 10 in 2025. 9 of them as part of Angelia's Endless Drama project to read some plays each month, and 1 for Victober. And but that was a reread. So picking from the 9 that weren't rereads, I'm going to pick a top 2. One of those is the Laramie Project by Moises Kaufman and the Tectonic Theatre Project. It was first came out in 2007. It's about a homophobic murder that took place in the town of Laramie, and it's documentary theatre. So it's based on interviews with people, residents or people who work in Laramie, about their sort of recollection of the events, and then bringing that together as a piece of drama, but all based on people's real words. Very moving, powerful, desperately sad, because we're moving back in that direction, sadly, whereas I felt like we were moving forward. Anyway, there you go. Drama is good for that, isn't it? As poetry is for making you feel those emotions and the other play that I want to mention is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern by Tom Stoppard. Now, that was originally published in 1966, so it's an older one, and it's a riff on Hamlet. So, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are characters in Hamlet, and Stoppard kind of takes them and sort of looks at Hamlet from the back, as it were, from minor characters. What a brave thing to do, kind of taking on Shakespeare. And he does something so funny and almost surreal at times, absurd, really entertaining, also emotional sometimes. And he's really looking at the human condition, I guess. And one reason why I really I'm really glad, and perhaps why it's sort of, it was a joy to read it, but also why it's sort of, now I think of it as one of the plays of the year for me, was of course we read it in September and then he died. Tom Stoppard died in November, so it was sort of lovely to have that. I had that recent experience of one of his plays, which I had never read, although I had seen it performed. So there you go. That's my top 2 plays. Now, short stories, as you know if you watch this channel regularly, are not normally my thing. You know, it's not like I can enjoy an individual short story a lot, but if I read a whole collection, I get a bit frustrated because each story I think, oh, I could have done with a bit more of that. But this year I did actually read 9 collections of short stories, which is an unusual number for me to read as many as 9. And one of those was definitely one of my best reads of the year. And really, you know, when something kind of takes you by surprise a bit, because I read Plain Tales from the Hills by Rudyard Kipling. This was like kind of his first published collection before he started to write novels and things like The Jungle Book, for which he's better known, or Kim, or, you know, so from early in his career. And they are so funny and so acute and so just kind of take apart kind of British colonial society in India in a really a way that just really, as I say, slightly took me by surprise, and I really enjoyed. And I've realised Kipling is a masterful short story writer. So a book of short stories gets into my tops of the year. So those are all my tops of things that aren't novels and novellas. Novels and novellas to come in another video, but let's just visit the bottom tranche of my year. Now, ratings are a bit arbitrary, but these are the things that were sort of below, 3 stars in my reading year. And I don't get a lot of those. Why do I not get a lot of those? Because I pick what I read really carefully. I'm aiming for everything to be at least a 4-star read, whatever that means for me. I don't want to read stuff, life's too short to read stuff that I'm not interested in or don't enjoy or think is poor. And I will abandon things if I think they're heading that way. But I did end up reading just a few things that I found really poor or disappointing. I tend to be positive in when I talk about my reading. So, but I don't often talk about things that I don't like or don't mention them much, but here we go. This year I read for the Reading the Globe project some middle grade and YA books, and I don't normally read much in the way of middle grade and YA. It's not, if I'm not reading it aloud to a child, it's, I don't always, it's not where I turn, put it that way. Not that I don't value it, but it's just not, my habit. But I did, because we had a middle grade and YA strand for Reading the Globe, and I read some absolutely brilliant books as part of that. I mean, none of them have made my best of the year, but there were some real goodies in there. But also a couple of YA books that I just really didn't have. It just reminded me why I don't read YA in particular. One was The Forgotten Book by Mechthild Glaser, and the other was Reckless Petrified Flesh by Cornelia Funke. I think I was particularly disappointed by the Reckless, because I've actually really enjoyed reading some of her children's books aloud to my children when they were younger, and I kind of had high hopes of that. And just, I don't think it's just me. I just don't think it was that good. And I think there's people write series and keep churning out. I don't know. Yeah. Books that are by someone whose books you previously loved, there's a sort of, you probably rate them even lower when you're disappointed by them because of that disappointment, don't you? But also, sometimes there are books that you've been meaning to read for years, that you've heard lots about, and you finally get around to. And if they turn out to be a disappointment, that can make you rate them perhaps lower than they deserve. I don't know. And a book like that for me this year was one of the non-fiction books that I read, and that was Oliver Sacks' The Woman Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Brilliant title. It was a book that came out in 1985. I've heard so much about it over the years. It's a book kind of case histories, I suppose, case stories of people with neurological disorders that he's encountered in his working life, as a clinician. And, it's been really influential. It's really popular. It's still in print. I found it slightly, it left a bad taste in my mouth. It hadn't aged well, I thought. It was almost not exactly exploitative, but I don't know, almost disrespectful for me. I don't know. Anyway, that's how I felt about it. So that was one of my bottom books. And then there is one book amongst the novels that I read. I read some novels that were sort of, perhaps mediocre, that only warranted sort of 3 stars, that didn't quite make the 4-star, threshold that I hope most things I read will make. But one novel I read that I really just actively disliked. In fact, I hated it. And that was All Fours by Miranda July. I read it as part of the BookTube prize, so I had to finish it. Otherwise, I probably would have abandoned it, because I could, after, by the time I was about a third of the way in, I knew that it was a book that was just annoying me. Now, I can see why people love Miranda July. She has this kind of, she's very smart. Her writing, the writing quite sparkles at times. She has this kind of sassy quality that people find appealing. She just wound me up and irritated me, and I really didn't like that book. And that was my lowest rated book of 2025. So there you go. Now you know. And I will be back soon with novels and novellas of all types, from classics through backlist to modern and also translated.